Welcome to our second session on our five-part discussion of the introduction to the Bible. In this session, we'll be discussing the Bible as ancient literature. So fundamentally trying to understand how the Bible functions as an ancient piece of literature, what it meant within its historical and religious context within the ancient Near East, and how that can help us as modern readers and better inform our reading and our understanding of the biblical text. So last time in our previous session, we discussed the origins of the Bible, where we saw how the Bible must sort of predominantly be understood as a piece of ancient literature, both in the sense of when it was written, but also how it was transmitted and read as ancient literature by ancient peoples, and how it communicated ideas and worldviews of language that preserved this ancient view. And so in this session, what we're going to do is further examine the notion of the Bible as ancient literature, and we're going to compare it to a couple of other pieces of ancient literature to sort of better understand the context and the culture that the Bible was written in and how it communicates in that context. So reading the Bible as modern readers, we often find that a lot of language, imagery, and some of even the basic elements of the stories we read are bewildering. Much of the Bible takes place in the ancient world with ancient peoples and ancient cultures and customs, all of which the Bible just simply communicates in and presents rather unapologetically. And so this is because the Bible first is written by ancient people for ancient people. And this is why the Bible does little in the way of explaining the ancient concepts and language, and instead just assumes that the reader understands them. And this creates a problem then for us as modern readers, mainly because we don't inhabit this same context. And this sets us as a disadvantage when it comes to reading the text in front of us. So in order to overcome this obstacle, we as readers have to engage with the biblical text through the eyes of the authors themselves by adopting their worldview. And so in this, we're going to take our cue from John Walton, who's done a lot of work in this area. And he says that when we study an ancient text, we cannot make words mean whatever we want them to, or assume that they meant the same thing to ancient audiences that they do to modern audiences. Language itself is a cultural convention, and so the Bible and other ancient documents which communicate in language have to be understood as being bound to their respective cultures. So as interpreters, we must adapt to the language or the context, the culture matrix of these ancient world and ancient literatures to help us understand when we study the Bible. He goes on to say that for those who have an interest in understanding the Bible, it should be no surprise that this Israelite literature reflects not only the specific culture of the Israelites, but many aspects of the larger culture identifiable across the whole ancient Near East. Even when a biblical text engages in polemic or offers critiques of the larger culture, to do so, its authors had to first be aware of and interact with the current thinking and literature of their day. So when we compare the literature of the ancient Near East with the Bible, we're ultimately trying to recover aspects of this ancient cognitive environment that may help us to understand the Israelite perspective a little better. And so by doing this, hopefully, we will learn more about them and their world, which will help us to discover ways that they may have thought in ways and communicated in ways that differ from how we think. So to first understand and to do this, actually, we need to understand the historiographical and geographical context, the ancient context that these pieces of literature were written in. This obviously takes us to what the ancient Near East is. So the Old Testament spans a time period dating from the early Bronze Age to the early Classical period, about 1,500 to 2,000 years. Again, the datings can differ. It depends on who you ask. It's a debated question. But regardless of this, it expands a large period of the Bronze Age to the Classic period, roughly from 2000 to 400 BC, and predominantly the narratives of the Bible are set within a region known as the Fertile Crescent, which stretched from the Nile Delta in Egypt to the northern parts of Syria. So Walton describes, he says, the world of the Old Testament is usually identified with the Fertile Crescent. This area included the narrow plains along the Mediterranean coast of Palestine rather, and the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. Adequate rainfall and irrigation along these coastal plains and river valleys permitted agriculture and settled life, giving rise to the earliest civilizations of the ancient Near East. And this is a map of the region This is predominantly the entire world for the biblical authors, stretching from Egypt to the Caspian Sea in the north of Syria. You've got the Great Sea or the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea and the Lower Sea to the bottom. Obviously, what we would call the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, all of these things. This, however, is the extent of the biblical world, predominantly known nowadays as the Middle East or the ancient Near East. And this is the context in which the Bible is set. This is where the culture is derived from, and therefore sort of the literary context is set against this background. Martin Noth explains, he says, the Old Testament originated in the great productive world of the ancient Near East, a world of extremely varied forms and of long and complicated history, which began millennia before the time of the Old Testament. Old Testament history is inseparably connected in countless ways with this milieu or this cultural setting. And that's an important point to realize. I think very emphatically he says that the Old Testament is inseparably connected, which means that to understand the Old Testament history and therefore the theology of the Bible, we need to understand the ancient history of the ancient Near East. Therefore, to interpret the Old Testament, he says it's necessary to understand the characteristics of the ancient Near East, its life, and its history. So that's the cultural context. That's the starting point that we need to begin with in understanding the background to the Bible. Going forward, though, we also need to understand the Sitz in Leben of the text. Sitz in Leben being a German phrase, it simply means setting in life. And what this means is that when we read text, we need to ask the questions like, what did the text mean to the original audience? How did the text relate to their lives? And what was its place within their worship or religion or their cultural or social environment? Walton says that we as readers need to read the Old Testament in the context of its own cultural river. And I think the image of the cultural river is really helpful. It's this idea that being in this river, you flow with the current and you can't sort of go against that idea. And so it's very difficult for individuals to go against the current, so to speak, of their cultural river. And that's where it's quite a bit of a jump for us as modernists, for example, to jump out of our cultural river and take a step into the ancient cultural river, which at many times is flowing in a very different direction with many different presumptions and assumptions that it makes. And so it can be quite difficult. So I think the image there of a cultural river is helpful. He continues and says that we can't afford to read instinctively, as in reading in our own context, because that only results in reading the text through our own lenses, our own cultural lenses. No one reads the Bible free of cultural bias. I think that's a very important claim. Instead, we must seek to replace our cultural lenses and our cultural biases with the cultural lenses and biases of those who wrote the text in the first place. That's how we read it responsibly. Elmer Ringren plays off this idea and he says, Israel didn't develop in a religious vacuum, but stood in close relationship to its neighbors in both the religious as well as the cultural domains. The comparative study of the Bible then not only helps us to better understand the wider context of the Bible, but also it plays an important role in determining the uniqueness of the Israelite religion. So what we're going to be trying to do in these sessions is comparing the biblical literature to other ancient Near Eastern literature, but not with the purpose of trying to figure out how the Bible is just the same as these other pieces of literature, but rather actually trying to point out the uniqueness and the way in which the Bible or the Israelite religion and literature stands apart from these other cultural examples. He says that things that sound similar do not always mean the same as they do in an alien culture. Only precise analysis can determine in each case the nature and meaning of such correspondences. And when we look at these correspondences, he says that the first question that should be asked in comparative research is that of the Sitz in Leben, the situation in life, and the meaning of the extra-biblical parallel adduced. He says it's not until this has been established that the parallel can be utilized to elucidate a biblical fact. So in other words, we can't just look at the Sitz in Leben of an Israelite text and the Sitz in Leben of an Egyptian text, for example, and assume that because they come from the same period and have a similar culture, they therefore mean the same thing. That would be irresponsible to do that. What we need to do is look at each text in its individual context. And from comparing the two individual contexts, we can decide whether or not, like he says, the meaning of this parallel is applied to both, or if in fact, like we will see, that the meaning of one is very different from the other. So one thing that's clear and should be pointed out that is in comparison study, we're not trying to find necessarily that everything is the same, but rather from the similarities and differences, try and understand how they might relate to each other, but also how they might be different from each other. So the best place to start is with the understanding of cosmology. Our first step in discussing the Bible within its ancient context is understanding how the authors themselves view the world around them. For this, we have to understand ancient cosmology. Cosmology simply coming from the two Greek words cosmos and logos. Cosmos, universal world, logos, knowledge or word. It simply just refers to a culture's understanding of the universe around them or the world around them. And we need to understand this cosmology because the Bible will be communicating in this language to us. Again, I think Walton is helpful here. He says, a culture's cosmic geography plays a significant role in shaping its worldview and offers explanations for the things we observe and experience. If we want to aspire to understand the culture and literature of the ancient world, whether it be Canaanite, Babylonian, Egyptian, or Israelite, it's therefore essential that we understand their cosmic geography. He continues and says that Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Canaanites, and Israelites all thought of the cosmos in similar ways. And they thought of the world as in terms of tiers, the earth in the middle with the heavens above and the netherworld below. And this is the general consensus of all ancient cultures. He says that people believed there was a single continent that was disc-shaped, with mountains that held up the sky, which they thought was solid. The heavens where deity dwelt were above the sky, and the netherworld was beneath the earth. And he says that the language of the Old Testament reflects the same view, and actually it doesn't seek to correct or refute it. One thing that's interesting though, because this can be a bit alarming to some people that the worldview is so different, is he does point out the fact that it's important to realize that this cosmic geography was predominantly metaphysical and only secondarily physical or material. And this is very different to how we as modernists understand the world around us. We communicate in terms of scientific materialism. We describe things as they are, or we like to think that that's how we describe things. And so when we describe a mountain, we would talk about the mountain in terms of its physical makeup, its structural makeup, rather than talking about it in its symbolic meaning or its religious significance or stuff like that. And that's where it means that the ancient understanding of the cosmos was largely metaphysical. It was a way to describe how things appeared to function and the meaning that those functions communicated, rather than an empirical materialist view that we as modernists tend to carry. And we can see this further when we actually see how the Bible communicates these realities. So, beginning with the understanding of the Earth as a flat disk with a large dome separating the Earth from the waters above. So the Bible describes this even at the start in Genesis 1. It says that there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. The Hebrew word there is rachia, and rachia communicates this understanding of a flattened out dome. It's based on the root racha in Hebrew, which is the same word used to describe a metalsmith's work in bashing out a flat sheet. For example, it's used in Exodus to describe the craftsman racharing the gold leaf to overlay the tabernacle, overlay the liturgical furniture of the temple space. And that's that same understanding. So here when the word is used in Genesis, it's the image of God racharing or spreading out a solid dome to separate the waters from the waters. The Rachakia is described like a dome stretched out by God. So in Isaiah 42, it says that God who created the heavens and stretched them out. The same sort of metaphysical metalworking language used there in stretching out the heavens. Likewise, the earth is set upon pillars or foundations. So you read that Yahweh establishes the earth on its foundation so that it will be never moved. He covers it with the deep as with a garment, and the waters stood above the mountains. So here we have this idea of the earth on these pillars and water underneath there and water above as well. We see in 1 Samuel 2:8, the pillars of the earth belong to Yahweh, and he has set the inhabited world on them. So the world is almost set on these pillars like a foundation, like a cornerstone. Job 38 uses this same language. It says, "Where were you at my laying of the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you possess understanding. Who determined its measurement? Yes, you do know. Or who stretched the measuring line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? On who laid its cornerstone?" And these are understandings of foundations or pillars using very much like a building terminology. This is the same language you would understand in building a building or a temple. The idea of the basis sunk, the cornerstone, the measurements and the measuring line. And this is effectively the way that the Old Testament communicates creation in this language. It says that when Yahweh assigned the limits to the sea will not transgress its command. He marked the foundations of the earth. Likewise, Zechariah 12:1 declares that Yahweh stretched out the heavens, he founded the earth, and he formed the spirit of humankind in its midst. And you can see even there in that scripture in Zechariah, this three-tiered understanding of the world. We've got the heavens above the earth, and then in between, the spirit of humankind manifested there. Beneath the world is the abyss, or the waters below, which are associated with chaos and the underworld. So, for example, in Psalm 24, we read that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell in it. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. So these seas and rivers are beneath the earth. The understanding of not making a carved image or an idol in the likeness of anything that's on heaven, on the earth, or the water beneath the earth. So there again we see the three-layered cosmos there, the heavens, the earth, and the sea beneath the earth. And the connection with the underworld is the understanding that under the waters the dead tremble. Sheol is naked, Abaddon has no covering. And so Sheol, or the underworld, is understood as being under these waters, the waters under the earth. We see this more in scriptures like Genesis 1:2, with the idea that there is darkness and void water hovering over the face of the waters, the face of the deep, which God will then separate into the heavens above and the waters below. And in Genesis 7, the understanding of the flood has this kind of context in mind. The fountains below and the waters above come back together to decreate the world and return it back to this initial state that we see in Genesis 1, verse 2. So we have to understand that three-layered cosmos to understand to understand the logic behind the flood, the waters above and the waters below. In the midst is the created state for man, and when those things come back together, it's almost a decreation, so to speak. So this is what we should be envisioning. It's this idea of a flat world with the foundations set, with the dome, with the heavens above and the sea beneath, and outside all of these things is chaos, and the raw materials that initially in Genesis 1 posed a threat to God's created world, now they are set at bay by his ordering of the universe. And there we can see those three tiers. We've got the waters below, the earth in the middle, and the heavens above. It tends to follow this same pattern, this same metaphysical, cosmological blueprint. We have other evidences for this three-tiered cosmos, in, for example, Psalm 18, which communicates the descent of Yahweh from the highest heaven to the lowest point, and utilizing these three tiers imagery. So obviously the first section talks about the earth reeling and the foundations of the mountain trembling. That's obviously the second tier, possibly even the first tier there as well. Yahweh bows the heavens and came down. He rode on a cherub and flew swiftly on the wings of the wind. That's obviously Yahweh descending from the highest heaven down to the earth and to the lowest point. And we read that the channels of the sea were seen, the foundations of the world were laid bare, and at his rebuke, the blast of the breath of his nostrils, he sent from on high and drew me out of many waters. And this is the understanding that the dead are underneath the waters. And so the psalmist here views himself as being in the world of the dead, and Yahweh descends from on high to the lowest point to redeem him. And obviously this is very incarnational. This is the understanding of Jesus, as Paul's language will say, Jesus descended in the incarnation, and that if he also descended, he also ascended as well, this idea of the highest heaven to the lowest point. Paul will use the same imagery. He'll talk about a man who is himself. In 2 Corinthians 12, we'll talk about, I know a man who was taken up into the third heaven. Paul clearly has the same three-tiered understanding. And this is also helpful to understanding the logic of passages, for example, in Jonah, where Jonah is taken into the belly of a sea beast and taken down beneath the waves, beneath the earth, into the waters below. And he regards that as being taken down to Sheol. And understanding that context helps us to understand Jesus when he will quote the Pharisees and say that I will show you the sign of Jonah obviously meaning that he will be taken down to the depths of the earth, much like Jonah was, under the sea into the underworld, where he will remain for 3 days. And just as Jonah was spat back out and resurrected, Jesus will also will arise again from that point. This is where I think the three-tiered cosmos and understanding the world this way really helps our understanding of just the whole biblical narrative as a whole, but also understanding claims like this that are made in the Old Testament. Moving forward from that, since the biblical portrait of the cosmos is situated within this wider cultural understanding, and the understanding of the cosmology of each of these cultures is similar, it shouldn't surprise us then that the biblical account of creation has many similarities with other creation stories that come out of this context as well. So during the late 19th and 20th centuries, biblical scholars and archaeologists recognized that the Bible's creation myth retained or reflected actually many details from other ancient Near Eastern creation epics, such as the ones that we find recorded in the Egyptian heretic papyri, or the Enuma Elish, for example, or the Hathor-Assis epic, the Babylonian flood narrative. And so what we'll do in this next section is look at a couple of these other stories and try and parallel them with the biblical understanding to better grasp what the cosmology and the creation stories in each text mean and the meaning of the biblical versions of that. So we'll start with ancient Egypt. A starting point to note is that we actually don't have any continuous creation story in Egypt that's been preserved. Brunner states that all that comes down to us is in the form of fragments, but these fragments don't present a complete picture of the numerous and varied Egyptian conceptions of creation. So there are actually many different accounts in Egyptian history as the civilization grew and diminished and was overturned and returned and all these different things. There's many different views, which is not like the Bible. The Bible retains a singular regional view, so to speak. It's generally the Egyptian view that the creation did not come out of nothingness, but out of the primeval sea, the Nun, which was unbounded, unmoved, and full of potential without being creative, which is very similar, I suppose, to the Genesis understanding that there is God present, and then there is darkness over the face of the deep, and the world being without form and void. In it and from it, the God created a first piece of firm land, the primeval hill, which is his starting point for creation. And likewise, we see that Yahweh, once he separates the waters and the heavens above, he erects or pulls the earth out of the waters, and that's sort of his starting point for creation. Interestingly, according to another story, the god flies over the primeval waters in the form of a bird and lays the primeval egg upon it. And we have the same understanding in the Genesis account. The Spirit of God is brooding over the waters, and the Hebrew word there for brooding is sort of the image of a mother hen over her chicks, over her eggs. And likewise, when God sends the flood, and then when he recreates the world again after the flood, which definitely resembles a form of decreation, we read that he sends a wind to push back the waters. And the Hebrew word there for wind is the Hebrew word ruach, which is the Hebrew word for spirit. And so even in the recreation after the flood, you have this idea of the spirit brooding over the waters again. And we see there's lots of parallels in this. So from the heretic papyri here, I've got a section from 1466 and 3055. We read that when the heaven had not yet come into being, when the earth had not yet come into being, when men had not yet come into being, when the gods had not yet been born, Amun was the God who was in the very beginning, when no God had yet come into being, when no name of anything had been named. This idea that God is preeminent, the idea that God is before all creation and that everything, before anything existed, God did. We have the idea that in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created, implying that God is preeminent. We also have the idea that, so for example, in Psalm 90, verse 2, that before the mountains were brought forth or the earth was formed, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So God is preeminent in that understanding. And even in the understanding of Genesis 2, where there's this idea that the no bush of the field, no land had yet appeared, no plant of the field had sprung up. This idea that before all this had happened, God was creating and existing. It's very similar to the understanding of no earth, no men, no heavens, and no names for anything, especially the understanding of names in the Egyptian understanding parallels with the biblical portrait. In the Turin Papyrus, we read, I am he who made the earth and knotted the mountains and created what is on them. I am he who made the waters. I am him who made the heaven and the mysteries of the two horizons. I am he who makes the hours so that the days come into being. I am he who makes the festivals and creates the waters of the rain. In the same understanding, Psalm 135 will communicate the same reality. It will say that to Yahweh, who by understanding made the heavens, to him who spread out the earth above the waters, he who made the great lights, the sun and moon to rule, for his steadfast love endures forever, the moon and stars to rule over them. It's this idea that really parallels with the Turin Papyrus, that he who made the heavens, he who made the earth, and the understanding of making the sun and the moon and the stars corresponds with the Egyptian understanding of making the hours, making the festivals. Because, of course, in Genesis, the sun, moon, and stars are set for times and seasons and festivals. And so this is the understanding there. Also in Psalm 65, we read that, O God, you are the one who by his strength established the mountains, girded with might, stilled the roaring seas, the roaring of the waves, so that those who dwell at the ends of the earth are in awe. You make the going out of the morning and the evening to shout for joy. The same understanding there, creation of the heaven, creation of the mountains, creation of the seas and the earth, and then the morning and the evening and the sun, moon, and stars. So you can see just in those brief examples, there are a lot of parallels with ancient Egyptian understanding of creation and the biblical portrait. Moving forward from there, we see that in Mesopotamia, there is a similar understanding, a similar portrait on view with the biblical understanding. So in Mesopotamia, there's no definite primeval history of the kind we find in the Bible, a little bit more formulated than Egyptian mythology, but in the same way that Egypt has no one set story, Mesopotamia also has no one set story. Instead, what we find are certain ideas, or we could maybe call them stories, that are reminiscent of the Old Testament notions of paradise, and the kings before the flood story, and the confusion of tongues. So what we have are parallels between the mythical epic poetry of ancient Mesopotamia and the biblical creation stories in particular, but no set tradition that we can draw upon in the way that we could draw upon a set tradition in Genesis. In the Enuma Elish, for example, it says that when in the height of heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, the primeval Apsu and Chaos Tiamat, the mother of both, their waters were mingled together. What we have here is similar to the understanding of Genesis 1, 2 to 3, where the earth is formless and empty, so there's no name, there's no form given. Darkness is over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. This idea of the waters above and waters below are mingled. Like in the Enuma Elish, Apsu is the heavens and Tiamat is the deep, and they are mingled together. This is the same thing communicated in Genesis 1, that the surface of the waters here is the mingled, pre-separated waters of chaos that is on view in Enuma Elish. In the hymn to the Mattock, we read that the Lord truly created the right order, the Lord whose decisions are unalterable. Enlil hastened to divide the earth from the heaven, and he accomplished the division between heaven and earth. And this again is the understanding of the separation of the waters below and the waters above, and we see that in Genesis 1, verses 6 to 9. We read that God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, let it separate the waters from the waters, and God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and he called the expanse heaven. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and he called the dry land earth, and the waters he gathered he called sea. And see, what we have here is the Lord truly creating right order. It's not Enlil the Lord, it's Yahweh the Lord, but it's still a very similar ancient understanding that the Bible seems to agree with in the ancient Near Eastern view. One thing that is predominantly different, at least on the surface level though, is the idea of Chaoskampf in ancient Near Eastern literature, especially in ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian, Akkadian, Babylonian literature. The idea of Chaoskampf is very prominent. And we do have examples of also in Egyptian religion as well, the idea of chaos striving to decreate the world every day, as Ra rides his sun barge across the sea, and Apophis, the chaos serpent, strives to devour the sun and send the world back into chaotic darkness. And we see this also in ancient Mesopotamian literature. But this seems to be generally unlike the account we see in Genesis 1 to 2. But it is the most prominent trope of ancient Near Eastern creation stories, as I just explained. The Chaoskampf, or literally German for chaos battle or war with chaos, where creation is established via a conquest or a divine combat between normally the creator god and the god of chaos herself. In the Enuma Elish, for example, which I'll read you an excerpt from in a second, Tiamat, the embodiment of chaos, has to be subdued by the creator god Marduk in order for the created order to be established. And he then utilizes the corpse of his slain enemy to create the world. He separates her into waters above and waters below. Quite a gory, quite violent understanding, but this is nevertheless the ancient Near Eastern understanding of creation. So this is the Enuma Elish here. We read from tablet 5, verse 94 onwards. This is a small snippet. Then advanced Tiamat and Marduk, the counselor of the gods. To the fight they came on, to the battle they drew nigh. The Lord spread out his net, and caught her, and the evil wind that was behind him he let loose in her face. As Tiamat opened her mouth to its full extent, he drove in the wind, while as yet she had not shut her lips. So effectively what we're imaging is that he holds her mouth open by the power, by his storm or weather powers. The terrible winds filled her belly, and her courage was taken from her, and her mouth was open wide. Marduk seizes on this opportunity, and seizing his spear, stabs his spear into her mouth, into her belly, and burst her belly, severed her inward parts, and pierced her heart. He overcame her and cut off her life. He cast down her body and stood upon it. When he had slain Tiamat the leader, her might was broken and her host was scattered. What you have here is this idea of the creator god subduing the chaos serpent, breaking her head and standing on her head and scattering her host. And obviously this reminds us a lot of the even the Christian understanding of Christ standing on the head of the serpent, as described in the Proto-Evangelium in Genesis 3, where you will bite his heel, but he will crush your head. This is found even in ancient Near Eastern understanding, which I think is very interesting. Goes on that the Lord stood upon her hind parts, and with his merciless club smashed her skull. There's the breaking the head of the serpent understanding. He cut through the channels of her blood and made the north wind bear them away into secret places. And then the Lord rested, gazing upon her body. And this is very similar to the understanding in Genesis of Yahweh resting and surveying his creation, whereas here it's Marduk resting and surveying the carnage of his victory. While he divided the flesh of the tablet is broken there, it goes on to say he devised a cunning plan. He split her like a flat fish in two halves. Very violent imagery here, but this is the understanding of splitting the waters from the waters in Genesis 1. One half of her he established as covering for heaven, and he fixed a bolt and stationed a watchman, bade them not to let the waters come forth. Again, this is the idea of the Rachia in Genesis 1, keeping the waters above at bay. And in that Rachia, we read that Marduk made the stations of the gods, which is likened to the stars and the images of the zodiac and the star symbols. And this is the same understanding we have in Genesis 1, where the stars, moon, and sun are fixed in the firmament, in the Rachia that God has established in the heavens above to keep these waters at bay. So when we read this, initially we would be probably stretched to think of examples of this in the Bible. We wouldn't normally associate with this language of Genesis 1. Genesis 1 definitely doesn't communicate in this way. But what's interesting that even though it's absent in Genesis, we do find hints of it in other creation traditions throughout the Hebrew Bible. And when we speak of other creation traditions here, what we mean is just simply other iterations or maybe mythical forms that have been retained in wisdom literature or psalms, poetry, and prophetic literature that relate to Genesis 1, but have almost a prophetic or a poetic retelling of the events. We read in Psalm 89, for example, you are ruling the surging of the sea. When its wave rise, you yourself still them. You yourself crushed Rahab like one who is slain. You scattered your enemies with your strong arm. Rahab here is an image of Egypt, but also an image of a chaos serpent. And the idea of scattering the enemies once Rahab is slain is very similar to Marduk scattering the host of Tiamat when he defeats her in battle. Job 26 is perhaps more um, clear. It says that by his power he stilled the sea, by his understanding he struck down Rahab, by his breath the heavens are made clear, and his hand pierced the fleeing snake. So here Rahab is understood as a sea serpent. And here, just as we saw in the Inume Elish with Tiamat and Marduk, the idea of God using breath or wind to split the seas and destroy the serpent is very common here. Isaiah 51, awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Yahweh. Make awake as in days of long ago, the generations of long time back. Are you not the one who cut Rahab into pieces, the one who pierced the sea dragon? Are you not the one who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, the one who made the depths of the sea a way for those who are redeemed to cross over? And the understanding here is obviously in the context of the Exodus. So Yahweh splitting the Red Sea with his breath and Israel walking across is likened to a reimagining of the creation event where God split the seas. And it's envisioned here as him destroying the sea dragon. Israel escaping from Egypt is almost viewed as a recreation or a new creation. And so the creation of the nation of Israel is likened to the creation of the world in this poetic, prophetic imagery. Psalm 74 is probably the best example of this, and it says, But God has been my king from long ago, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You split open the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food to the desert-dwelling creatures. You split open spring and wadi. You dried up ever-flowing rivers. Yours is the day. Yours is the night. You established the light and the sun. Define the boundaries of the earth. Summer and winter you formed them. This is a very explicit reference to the Chaoskampf, so Yahweh defeating the sea serpent and killing Leviathan and the heads of the sea monster, is then likened with his creating of the world. So the language of the day, the night, the sun, the moon, the boundaries of the earth, and the seasons like summer and winter is understanding the Genesis account of God creating the heavens, the earth, the waters, the sun, moon, and stars for seasons and times, etc. So this here, Psalm 74, explicitly connects the Chaoskampf with the creation event of Genesis 1. What's important to note about all these things is why is the Bible quoting these forms of mythic poetry if it doesn't necessarily view the same claims and religious understandings of the ancient Near East? And the reason is, I think, best summed up by Otto Eisfeld's understanding, where he says that in any case, it's not here a delight in myth which expresses itself, but rather the desire to present the glory and victoriousness of the one and only God Yahweh as vividly as possible, and to depict the sinfulness of rebellion against him. It's like we mentioned earlier, a polemic purpose that God here is enthroned as ultimately victorious. He is more powerful than the ancient Near Eastern gods because there is no struggle, there is no war that needs to be waged. God simply does, and chaos is defeated. He simply raises his voice or breathes the breath of his nostrils, the understanding of breathing out words and language, simply subdues chaos without a fight. And so the purpose here is to describe Yahweh as more powerful. So that concludes our section on cosmology and creation. With all that in mind, I think the next stage we can move on to is the understanding of the ancient Near Eastern gods and temples, divinity, and the divine dwelling places, and how that relates to the biblical view. So our discussion of the concepts of the cosmos and the creation will help our understanding of the cultic practices of both Israel's neighbors and Israel herself. And it reveals a lot about their understanding of the cosmos, especially their understanding of the divine space and the connection between the gods and their dwelling places. R.C. Clements, excuse me, has a interesting introduction to this. The idea of the cosmos communicating the logic behind gods, their names, and their dwelling places. He says that it's not enough to simply know the name of a god, but also to be informed of his dwelling place so that he could be visited. In the developed regions of Mesopotamia, the question of the divine dwelling place assumed an important place, and each deity was assigned his or her role. Even where religion was less sophisticated and where no such prominence was given to temples in Mesopotamia, for example, the question of knowing where the god's presence could be found was of vital interest. Certain localities could be identified as the dwelling places of God, with appropriate altars erected where a theophany had occurred. In such case, an important part of the tradition of the sanctuary was its foundation legend, which is how the first place had been recognized as the abode of the god who was worshipped there. And this is sort of the logic behind when we read in Genesis, for example, where either Abraham or Jacob or Isaac encounter God in a place, they then build an altar there. There's this idea that places are connected with theophany or revelation of God, and that when someone encounters God in that place, they will commemorate that by building an altar or a temple. And that's sort of what he means by the foundation legend of the sanctuaries is that they're connected with these very real experiences that people had that then lead to the cultic or religious practices associated with them. So, in line of this, he says that the great ziggurats of Samaria, for example, were an attempt on the part of men to build mountains which could serve as divine dwelling places. And I should say that Clements goes on in that same section I just mentioned earlier to describe the prominence of divine mountains in the biblical understanding, because mountains, of course, are connected with the heavens and the earth, and they are often places where men meet with God. And so their temples in Samaria, ziggurats, were designed to be sort of artificial mountains, which could serve as divine dwelling places. Walton agrees with this. He says that in Mesopotamia, the primary imagery of the temple was that it was the center of the cosmos and was the architectural embodiment of the cosmic mountain. This concept is present in Neo-Assyrian, Syro-Palestinian, and Ugaritic texts, as well as in the Bible. So these are just a couple of examples of these texts. We read in the Enuma Elish once Marduk defeats Tiamat, he then builds a sanctuary to rest in, very much like the temple language of Genesis 1. It says that we will make a shrine, which is to be called chamber that shall be our resting place. We shall find rest therein, and lay out the shrine. Let us set up its emplacement. When we come thither, we shall find rest therein. Make Babylon the task that you request. Let its brickwork be formed to build high the shrine. And of course, the idea of the brickwork, the tower built, the resting place, that of course the name Babylon reminds us of the account in Genesis 11 of the building of Babel. Babel being the Hebrew word for Babylon there. And so that's definitely the logic behind that story. We'll get a little bit more on that in a second. In the Gudea Cylinder from ancient Mesopotamia, we read that the temple is understood as the mooring pole of the land, which grows high between heaven and earth. The Eninu, the true brickwork, for which Enlil, the creator god, decreed a good destiny. The beautiful mountain range, which stands out as a marvel and which towers above the mountains. The temple, which is itself a big mountain, reached up to heaven and filled heaven's midst. So this is the understanding of the heaven and earth connection that mountains represent, and obviously temples were built to represent this reality. Walton will go on then to say that this is the same in the Bible. So Mount Zion, for example, is understood as the mountain of Yahweh in Psalm 48, and the place where his temple was built, which was itself a representation of Eden. For ancient Israel, the Temple of Solomon, indeed the Temple Mount and all of Jerusalem by extension, is a symbol of this reality, a mythopoeic realization of heaven on earth, paradise, the Garden of Eden. Mythopoeic simply meaning the way that a story is conveyed as relating to a reality. So a mythological concept that's made manifest through the stories and legends of a culture. And this all connects to the first temple, which in the biblical understanding is Eden. Gordon Wenham, he goes on to say that the Garden of Eden is not viewed by the author of Genesis as simply a piece of Mesopotamian farmland, but an archetypal sanctuary that is a place where God dwells and where man should worship him. Many of the features of that garden may also be found in later sanctuaries, particularly the Tabernacle and the Temple of Jerusalem, and these parallels suggest that the garden itself is understood as a kind of sanctuary. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams that will illustrate this a little bit more clearly. First is this. This is the setup of the tabernacle compared to the regional understanding and description of Eden in Genesis 1 to 2. We read that there is the dry land, and then that is the world created by God. And then in Genesis 2, God, especially in a region of that land called Eden, plants a garden in that region, and then in that region there is a central understanding connected to the tree of life at the center of the garden. And the point of that is to convey that the tabernacle and the temple was set up in a similar way. The land of Israel outside the temple courts, the courtyard as the sacred land, the holy place as the garden temple itself, and then the Holy of Holies being the central focal point of that holy point, like the tree of life and God's presence. So that's how the one way of envisioning the connection between Eden and the tabernacle and later the temple. I know another way to view it would be this diagram, which shows the directional change from humanity leaving creation in the fall and then the atonement that leads it back to it. And obviously in that diagram, feel free to pause at this point if you want to look at the diagram further, but I won't linger on it too much, but I just want to show you this in order to demonstrate that this is definitely the logic behind the biblical passages, the depictions of the garden, and then the depictions of the temple. James B. Jordan picks up on this idea as well, and he says that the idea of a holy mountain is a place where men meet God. Because the top of a mountain is nearest to heaven, this is why Israel sacrificed on high places. That's an important understanding to understand why people worshipped and sacrificed on high places. This idea that a mountain is the connection point between heaven and earth. Both mountains and pyramids are ladders to heaven. The Tower of Babel, for example, are ziggurats, and the pyramids of Egypt were counterfeit holy mountains. He digresses a bit here and says that the Tower of Babel, man tried to build such a pyramid ladder from the ground up. And this is what I was mentioning before, that the Tower of Babel is this understanding of reinstating Eden on humanity's own terms. We read in Genesis 11, if we're probably all familiar with this story, that when people migrated from the east, they settled in the land of Shinar, and they came together, burnt bricks, and built a tower with bitumen and brickwork, and saying, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And then the Lord came down to the city and the tower which the children of men had built. And the understanding here, we often think that the tower was built so that man could reascend into heaven and storm heaven. But I think it's much more clear that what man is trying to do is reinstate the sacred mountain of Eden and bring God's presence back down to earth. And that's why then God comes down to earth, but instead of bringing blessing and the presence that humanity was trying to achieve on their own terms, God appears similar to the way he does in the garden in Genesis 3. He appears in judgment to send humanity out into exile. So this is almost a repeat of the Eden narrative here, and we'll look a little bit about that further in some of our later sessions. But suffice it to say, this is the understanding behind that passage. This understanding is also behind the construction and the symbolism of altars in the Bible. So Jordan will say that it remains to note also that the altars were also holy mountains. They were ladders to heaven. And this is understood in the idea that you place your sacrifice on the altar and the burnt offering ascends to heaven from that altar. And it's very much a connection point, an axis mundi, for example, which simply just means sort of a connection between heaven and earth. It serves in that way. And that's what Jordan is saying here. He says, broadly speaking, then there's a parallel between the Tower of Babel and the altars of worship set up by the patriarchs. And you can see that in the understanding that the Tower of Babel was trying to relocate the divine presence. The altars of the patriarch are built to commemorate the interaction with the divine presence. And so that's what he's pointing out there. He says that while these altars were probably just pillars made of stones, what they symbolize is set forth in later prophetic visions. And this is a very interesting passage that I'll quote next. So this is from Ezekiel 43. And the description here is of the altar in the new temple, which was actually never built, but it serves rather as a prophetic eschatological image, which has a lot of theological flavor and weight to it. I won't read the description, but again, feel free to pause the video here and read that for yourself. Of special importance here, and this is something that James Jordan will point out, is the understanding of the altar hearth. This is something that Ezekiel makes reference to, I think at least 2 times, possibly 3 there in the passage. And this is a very interesting word in the Hebrew. Literally pronounced har'el, and it's pretty much a hapax legomena, which just means that it's never used anywhere else in the Bible. And this is, well, problematic because that means that we don't really have much context to go off of what it means. But some people have put forward the notion that possibly the word har'el is a combining of two Hebrew words, har being mountain and el being God. And Jordan certainly will make the point that the altar hearth built on top of the altar, or the harel built on top, is meant to carry this understanding of the theological weight of the mountain of God. And therefore the altar then is like a mini version of this, which I think is very interesting, at least interesting and compelling argument. And so he has this diagram in his book, and he portrays the idol in this way, excuse me, the altar in this way, where you have, in the same way that we had the layout of Eden and the tabernacle, here we have the same four-part layout in the stages and the levels of the altar. The bottom speaks of the world as connected to the world. The next layer is the Holy Land. The top is the Harel, the hearth or the mountain of God, if we translate it that way, which would correspond to the garden. And then the hearth on top is the idea of the divine presence, the dwelling place of the God, which corresponds to the Holy of Holies. And so I think that's a really compelling view that even in the altar themselves, there are these mini images of an axis mundi, a connection between heaven and earth. Jordan summarizes by saying that the altar described is in the form of a step pyramid, which is very much like the ziggurat imagery in the Tower of Babel. He says, while the altar in the tabernacle did not have this shape, so remember, this altar was never built. The description of the altar in Leviticus and Exodus and so forth, it doesn't correspond to this. This altar is predominantly in the prophetic eschatological literature and is more of a theological image than anything else. The statement in Ezekiel clearly expresses the theology of the altar. He connects it with Mount Sinai, which is a fascinating connection, I think. He says, Yahweh appeared on Mount Sinai and the top was covered with fire and smoke. We can hardly fail to see the visual association with the burning sacrifices on the bronze altar, so the burning on the top associated with the glory cloud on top of the divine mountain. It says, moreover, altars for sacrifice were generally built on top of mountains before the tabernacle was set up, and during the interregnum, or the period between the governances of the tabernacle and the building of the temple. And this is a diagram that I put together that I think illustrates his point a bit clearer. So what you can see is the correspondence between the altar that we just described and the mountain of God itself, Sinai, which is called the mountain of God in the Exodus passages. What you have is a correspondence with the levels of holiness and the levels of the altar. So if you recall from the story, Israel is allowed no further than the base of the mountain. Furthermore, the elders are allowed in the next level, but they're not allowed on the top of the mountain. Moses alone is able to go to the top of the mountain. But even then, he's not able really to stand in the presence of the glory cloud, which is God's manifestation. And that, I think, corresponds to the levels of the altar. You know, Israel at the base of the mountain is very similar to the understanding of the world and the unholiness and the general sinfulness of the world. The elders who are appointed, 70 is a very important number there, connected with the understanding of holiness and completeness. They're allowed on that second level up, which corresponds to the close proximity to the holy place. Moses alone, as God's representative, is allowed into the sanctuary, or the top of the mountain, where he receives the law of God and receives God's divine revelation. But even he is not able to stand on the hearth or the glory cloud section of the mountain. And I think that corresponds really neatly with the view of the altar that Jordan is portraying there. Feel free again to pause if you want to look at that a bit more, if you want to read that more, but I'll continue. What we see is that there are similarities between the temples of the ancient Near Eastern cultures and those of Israel, and this religious context in which they're both created. And that's sort of the takeaway that we see from all these things that I've been pointing out. But interestingly, G.K. Beale will make this point, and I think it's fascinating, is that while there are the idea of context and a religious understanding, we might actually find a fundamental connection between these different traditions that might be able to be tracked back to Eden, the initial temple, which forms the basis and the foundation upon which every later temple tradition was built. As I mentioned, G.K. Beale will talk about this. He says that though these were pagan temples, it's not likely that their resemblance to Israel's temple was due to coincidence or to Israel's mere dependence on her pagan neighbors for religious ideas. Rather, this resemblance of pagan temples to Israel's temple probably was due to the refracted and marred understanding of the true conception of the temple that was present from the very beginning of human history. He goes on to say that as human history unfolded, God's special revelation about the temple continued only with the faithful remnant of humanity, and the recollection of the true temple by those outside God's covenant community probably continued, but its memory became blurred. And he explains this, that nevertheless there were refracted glimmers of truth. And I like the image here of refracted glimmers like a light refracted through a diamond or a prism, that they all have the same source, but they go in very different directions. That there are glimmers of the truth that continued, so that some of the later temples of ancient Near Eastern cultures were designed that still retained features corresponding to God's own view. One could say, and I think this is brilliant, I think actually speaks to the entire phenomenon that we're discussing throughout this whole lecture, is that one could say that just as God's image in unbelieving humanity has not been erased but blurred, so their continuing conception of the structure where God would be worshipped was likewise blurred. And I think we can say that, as I said, for the whole thing we're looking at, the religious and cultic and cultural understandings of the world around them and who God is and how he operates might possibly point to a old ancient tradition that Israel and her neighbors drew from, which would be sort of symbolically represented in the understanding of Eden and the first temple and the first worship and the first man, etc., etc. So going on from that, I think we can now understand the cultic practices and then maybe use that to understand how the ancient Near Eastern cultures viewed their gods in light of that. So just as they shared a similar understanding of the temple and divine space, we see that the surrounding cultures also utilize many of the same epithets for their gods, an epithet just being a description of the attributes of someone or a title of someone. And these same epithets for their gods are used to describe Yahweh within the Hebrew Bible. I'm predominantly going to be quoting from the Baal cycle, which has a lot of interesting parallels with the descriptions of Yahweh. We see that in the Baal cycle, titles that are given to Yahweh are given to Baal. So Baal is Baal El-On, and Yahweh is El Elyon. So Baal Elyon translates to Lord Most High, and Yahweh as El Elyon translates to God Most High. And this is a common word for God throughout the whole of the Old Testament, even in the New Testament as well, translated into the Greek Uphistos, which means the Most High One. Baal is called the rider on the clouds, and Yahweh is the L'Rochev Be'erevot, the cloud rider, in Deuteronomy, Psalm 68, and Isaiah as well. And Baal is the Lord of the earth. Yahweh is the Melech Chol Haaretz, the King of all the earth. So you can see that the titles and the epithets of the God are very similar. Likewise, many of the details of the Baal cycle can be found in the Hebrew portrait of Yahweh. So where the God dwells and what he does, there's also parallels there. So Baal resides on Mount Zaphon. Yahweh's city is established on Har Zaphon, or Yirecheti Zaphon, the heights of Zaphon. Zaphon simply is just the word meaning the north. So Baal and Yahweh both have a similar dwelling place. In the same way, Baal's right to rule as Uphistos or Elyon, Most High, is challenged by Yam, the god of chaos, similar to the way that Marduk was challenged by the goddess Tiamat. In the same way, Yahweh, as we read in a lot of those Chaoskampf scriptures, he splits the waters and names them Yam in the Hebrew. So fascinatingly, the Hebrew word Yam is the same as the Canaanite word Yam, and they both communicate this idea of a chaos deity of the seas. Similarly, Yahweh, by his power, defeats and steals Yam to establish order, and that's in the passages of Job as well. Finally, we note that, rather interestingly, Baal is defeated and actually must be rescued from Mot, the god of death. Mot is the Hebrew word for death as well, and we know that Yahweh in passages like Isaiah 25 and Hosea 13 will defeat Mot, And so in the same way that Baal has a conflict with Mot, we see that Yahweh has a conflict with Mot. And reading further into the New Testament as well, we know that Jesus' battle in the grave, or his being defeated by Mot, is the way in which he ultimately defeats Mot, defeats death, or in the Greek defeats Thanatos. And that's sort of Paul's logic behind his quotation of Hosea 13 in the New Testament, where he says, "O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory?" So interesting, we have connections there. So just to summarize that quick section, we see that the titles like El or Baal or Most High God are used to describe both ancient Near Eastern deities as well as Yahweh, and this sort of shows a general understanding of deity in the ancient Near East. In the same way that the dwelling place and the deeds of these gods, like the Cloud Rider or the one enthroned in the north, or the Death Defeater, or the victim of death rather, sort of correspond with Israel's portrayal, and I think this gives evidence for a general understanding of deity in the ancient world, which could be traced back to an initial understanding of deity in the ancient world. Going on from the idea of gods, I think it would be helpful now to turn to idol worship, which is predominantly the way in which the ancient Near Eastern cultures worshipped their gods in a tangible, physical way. The notions of who the god was and where the god dwelt were deeply connected with how the god dwelt there, and this is kind of the logic and the prerogative behind the practice of idol worship. We note that in these practices, which we'll detail further in a second, certain rituals are implemented to aid the deity's transferal to the image, where it could be cared for or petitioned or ultimately worshipped. And in the ancient Near East, this was the concept of the opening of the mouth ceremony. R.E. Clements has a good way of describing the logic behind this, and he points it to the fact that the religions of the ancient Near East don't have a very strong mystical tone to them. He says that they don't have a strong mystical tone where the divine presence could be sought in an inward searching of the soul, and they didn't possess a rational philosophy like the concepts of deism and pantheism, which arise in Greek philosophy, the idea of pantheism being that God is in all and through all and can be perceived in all his attributes through creation. Obviously, that's present in the Bible, but it's not the typical ancient Near Eastern understanding. It says that instead of this, the most widespread attitude adopted towards the problem of the divine presence was to seek a solution in some form of symbolism, where a relationship was believed to be established between the natural and the spiritual worlds. And this again is the whole logic behind the divine mountain, the altar, the temple as an axis mundi, a connection between the spiritual and physical, the heavenly and the earthly. And thus, earthly objects are thought to be capable of becoming charged with supernatural power, and so establishing a link with the persons and abodes of gods. This kind of reasoning undoubtedly lies at the basis of the use of idols, which could, on account of their shape or substance, become one with the god himself. So that's kind of the logic behind idol worship and why it was a thing in the ancient Near East. Uri Gabe describes what he calls three levels or aspects of the manifestation of deity. And I think this is a side note, it's interesting to note how these three aspects could also relate back to the three tiers that we saw in the understanding of the cosmos. We've got the natural aspect, the God associated with the element of nature or the cosmos, which is sort of the highest aspect, which would relate to the highest heaven view. We've then got a characteristical aspect that God is associated with a certain trait, like a human trait, like society or wisdom or justice, which sort of goes down now to the ethereal, the human level, the physical level. And then the lowest level of this is a physical cultic aspect, where the god is represented in a human or anthropomorphic image, and then dwelled in a specific temple or location. And this is what idol worship focuses on. It focuses on the third aspect, where the image of the god is usually anthropomorphic, although symbolic images like celestial bodies or animals or stuff like that also existed. And you can see that in the prohibitions in Deuteronomy to describe you shall not make an image of those in the heavens above or the earth below and the animals and the fish of the sea, etc. Most of the time they're made from wood and stone and covered with precious metal like gold and sat in the innermost cellar of the temple. The cellar there is just meaning like the holy place where the priest presented offerings and recited prayers over. And I think it's interesting to point out that this is the same practice that's still present in Israel when they make the tabernacle. Certainly they're not making an idol of Yahweh, but they have a wooden box made of wood and has stone tablets in it, and it's overlaid with precious metal, and it sits in the innermost cellar of the temple, and the priest goes in once a year to offer blood and petitions before Yahweh. And so this same logic is still present in the Israelite religion. It's just not it's not as pagan, so to speak, and not as anthropocentric or man-centric. It's more theocentric or centered on God. This is an inscription of an incantation of opening of the mouth from the incantation of Ea. And we see the logic here of the statue becoming a dwelling place for the god and sort of being wholly sanctified and made in a state that the god can enter into it. Whereas the statue is an image of the gods and of man. This statue cannot smell incense without opening the mouth. It cannot eat. It cannot drink. O gods, be present on this day, be present for this statue before you. Determine its destiny greatly in its mouth, that it may eat, that its ears may be set for hearing. When the god was fashioned, the pure statue was completed. The god appeared in all the lands. It was created in heaven, it was created on earth, in the entire heaven and earth. And I think the logic of this incantation is that this statue is made by man, but it is certainly the image of a god, and it now has to be divinely blessed so that it becomes a dwelling place. So it's sanctified, becomes holy for the god to dwell in it. And the idea that it's a mirroring of the heaven and the earth. It's a creation of God and of man. It's created in heaven and on earth, and it serves as a axis mundi, a connection point for heaven to connect with the earthly realm, the spiritual charge of a natural physical object. Without the ceremony, the idol, like we read, cannot smell incense, cannot eat food, and cannot drink water. And the ritual then serves as a dedication of the sacred image for liturgical purposes, which transform it from a lifeless statue into a sacred image fit for the dwelling of the spirit of the god whom it represented. And so from this, we can see that when the ancients made idols, they weren't just fashioning physical images. They're not satisfied with just fashioning an image, but instead they performed these rites and steps on a statue so as to make the work of the human hands become alive, become divine. And this ceremony of the opening of the mouth had the purpose of making all the organs serviceable and vitalizing the image. And the logic behind this is the idea that in the ancient Near East, man is made for the purpose of serving the gods. So unlike Genesis 1, where man is made as the image of God to glorify God and to represent him in the world, which is a very high view of man when compared to the ancient Near East. The ancient Near East understanding is that man is made because gods are lazy and they cannot be bothered to serve themselves. And so man is dependent on the god for the seasons and the weather and blessing, but the god is just as dependent on the man to have food and sustenance and a place to live. This is what, for example, Walton will call the great symbiosis, but it's behind the understanding of idol worship. The gods need to be fed, need to be worshipped, and need to have a dwelling place, and without that, they're in a bad place. And this is the reason behind idol worship and why the opening of the mouth was so important for these idols to function as gods. Joshua Matson explains that because of the desire in Israel to be separate for the rest of the ancient Near Eastern context, predominantly by Israelites who want to observe the law strictly, there's more of a desire to separate themselves from the surrounding cultures. And so while they're aware of these purposes, and certainly we see evidence in and glimpses of it in the way that they made their own cultic images, they definitely want to separate themselves from these practices. And this led the Israelites to use the traditions and practice of their surrounding cultures against them. And this is polemic. This may describe the reason for the remnants of the opening of the mouth ritual in the Hebrew Bible, which there certainly are remnants of it in the Hebrew Bible. Remnants of this ceremony or ritual are found primarily in the form of parodies, which are aimed at mocking the ritual outside or against the superior actual communication of the one true and living God. And that's the purpose of these scriptures. They mock the practice, but they first have to understand the practice in order to do that. So you read that in Jeremiah 10, for example, "There is no one like you, O Lord. You are great, and your name is great in might. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? For this is your due. For among all the wise ones of the nations, and all their kingdoms, there is none like you. They are both stupid and foolish. The instruction of idols is but wood. Beaten silver is brought from Tarshish and gold from Uphaz. They are the work of the craftsman and of the hands of the goldsmith. Their clothing is violet and purple, and they are the work of skilled men. But the Lord is the true God, and he is the living God and the everlasting King. So the logic here is that while certainly the idols are dressed like kings and dressed like gods, they're none of the above. They're simply the work of skilled craftsmen fashioned out of wood and made to look pretty. And they bear nothing on the glory of the true King of the universe, who is Yahweh, the true God. Psalm 135 says that the idols of the nations are silver and gold and the work of human hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, nor is there any breath in their mouths. And this is an exact parallel, if you recall the opening of the mouth incantation. This is an exact parallel to that incantation. The idea of the mouth, the eyes, the ears, being able to eat, see, smell, drink, and breathe is deliberately reversed here. Those who make them become like them, and so do all who trust them. And there's an important understanding behind this, that in Genesis, man himself is actually made as the image of God, as the idol of God. So the Hebrew word used in Genesis 1 is that man is made as the tselem, or the selem of Yahweh. And that word selem in Hebrew is used throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible to refer to idols, to refer to images. And so we see that in that aspect. And then in another aspect, when we see that God forms man from dust and shapes him, the same way that an iconographer, an idol craftsman would shape the idol, Yahweh then breathes the breath of life into him, which is very reminiscent of the opening of the mouth ceremony. I think what that communicates is that Yahweh is forming his own idol and own image, and it's communicated in the way of the ancient Near East, but it serves a very different purpose. When we understand that, we can understand why idolatry is such a negative thing in the Bible. I think Psalm 135, verse 18, really points that out, where it says that those who make them become like them. We see this all the way through the Bible, the idea that the idea of worshipping idol is abhorrent to God, not because God is jealous in the fact that he wants all the glory and that he can't stand other people usurping him and that he can't stand other gods because he alone is the one God and yada yada yada. The understanding is that Yahweh made man as his idol image, his image bearer, and for man to denigrate himself to bowing down and worshipping a fake wooden image it enrages God. It offends God. We can see aspects of that in child sacrifice, for example, in the prophets and Jeremiah particularly, where Jeremiah will say that the Israelites worshipping Molech and sacrificing their children to Molech is like spitting in God's face, and that's communicated by the word used in Jeremiah of the place where they do it. It will be named Topeth, which is the Hebrew word for spitting in my face. So I think that's the whole, when we understand that broader context, we can understand why worshipping idols is so abhorrent to God and why it's such a big deal in the biblical text that men and humans don't do this. And I think Psalm 135 has that interesting glimpse that they who make them become like them. Habakkuk 2 says, woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, but there is no breath in it at all. And again, the idea that the idol might be glorious, but it has no breath, it is not animated, it is not like man. Man has breath. Breath animates man and makes him the idol image of God. But these less than par, subpar images are nothing compared to the true image of God. There's another understanding of the logic that man is made as God's image, as his idol, and the glorious appearance of idols compared to the glory of men. In Deuteronomy, I believe it might be chapter 4, I don't remember correctly off the top of my head, but there's this passage which says that the Israelites exchanged, in most English translations will read it, exchange the glory of God for the glory of idols. But the Hebrew there actually quite clearly says they exchanged their glory for the glory of idols. What that seems to be communicating is that men, when they bow down and worship other gods, they're exchanging their own glory for the fake, false glory of an image. And obviously, their glory is God's glory, because man's glory, of course, derives from God. But I think that's, again, the understanding why idol worship is so bad and so abhorrent, is because man is the glory of God, man is the image of God. And when they bow down to other images, it's like spitting in God's face. It's going completely against his design and his purpose. That's why God is jealous or passionate about this. And that's, I think, the logic behind why the Hebrew Bible is so against idol worship, and why you have these passages that portray it as, in vain. Often idols are called vain images, vain idols. It's not because they have no entity in them. The God that is present, the demon that is inhabiting is very present, but they are vain in the fact that they're futile when compared to the true God, the King of Kings, Yahweh of hosts. So thus, while Israel regarded the cultic practice of idol worship as abhorrent to Yahweh, they certainly still communicated in the same cultural context, using the same vocabulary and understanding to polemically oppose the practice. This shows that the writers of the Bible may have had at least a functional understanding of the practices, and we know that later Israel fell into the practices themselves, so they at least understood how this worked. As I pointed out earlier, we see images of this retained in the cultic images and the construction of the tabernacle in Israel themselves. But definitely the Bible has a negative view of this, which is very different from most other ancient Near Eastern texts. So with that, we can move now from the cultic and religious realm into the social realm, and we'll look at this through the lens of predominantly the law and ethics of the ancient world. The law of Moses is definitely not the only ancient Near Eastern law that's given by a god or by a king to his people. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, which predates the Torah of Moses by about 1,000 years, represents one of the earliest examples of lex talionis, or the law of retaliation, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, that we see present in the ancient Near East. And so while some would claim that this shows that the laws of Moses are indebted to the law of Hammurabi, for example, and that indeed the Hebrew law is actually dependent or inferior to the Babylonian laws, I think with careful comparative study we can see that there's actually a very different understanding and purpose of both that I think just discredits that claim altogether. And that's what we'll hopefully do in this next short section. So on some levels, the laws in both are very similar. For example, the lex talionis, or eye for eye, is the same. In the Code of Hammurabi, it says if a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out, and if he breaks the bone of another man, his bone shall be broken. And we see the same thing in Leviticus 24. When a man causes a physical injury to his fellow citizen, according to what he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. According to the physical injury he does to the person, likewise it shall be done to him. So the understanding here is that eye for eye, tooth for tooth, what you do to your neighbor will be done, and the sin will be brought back upon your head. So really there's not much difference here with the ancient Near Eastern laws. Similarly, we read in the Code of Hammurabi that if during a quarrel one man would strike another and wound him, then he shall swear, I did not injure him willingly, and pay the physician, and that's it. Whereas in Exodus, in the Torah, it actually goes further. It says if men quarrel and a man strikes his neighbor with a stone or with a fist, and he does not die but is confined to a bed, if he stands and walks about on the outside on his staff, the striker will be unpunished. He will only pay for the loss of his time and provide him to be fully healed. So there's a similar understanding here, but it seems to be that the Torah expects the perpetrator to go a step further. He must not only pay for the physician and the healing, but he must pay for the lost time that the man has lost in his sickness, but also nurse him back to health and make sure that he is fully healed. So there's more of an expectation put on the perpetrator there. Sometimes, though, they just completely have a different viewpoint. So when dealing with thieves, the Code of Hammurabi says that if a man has broken into a house, he should be killed before the breach and buried there. Just straight out. No chance at forgiveness or retribution. He's simply just killed and buried at the breach as a warning for others. Whereas in the law of Moses, if a man is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. So already there's a difference that in the Code of Hammurabi, there is no mention of the victim of the thief. Simply the focus is on the thief. But here, the victim has to be careful. If they strike the thief at night, they're not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens um, after sunrise, so during the day, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. A very high standard. Anyone who steals must surely pay restitution. So again, we have the idea that you're not killed, which is very gracious. You simply have to pay for what you stole. And then if you're not able to do that, you have to be sold yourself into servanthood to pay for the theft. So we don't have any understanding here of killing a perpetrator, but simply that they must repay for what they stole, which I think shows a very stark difference between the two. Likewise, if a man has borne false witness in a trial or has not established the statement that he has made, if in that case be a capital trial, the man shall be put to death. It's the Code of Hammurabi. So false witnesses instantly get death penalties. Whereas in Deuteronomy, it's a little less straightforward, but it's definitely more leniency given to a false witness. So if a false witness arises to accuse anyone to testify against them, then the two men to whom the legal dispute pertains shall stand before Yahweh, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. Then the judges shall make a thorough inquiry, and if it turns out that the witness is a false witness, and he has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he meant to do to his brother, and so you shall purge the evil from your midst. And I think what this shows is that, one, there is far more care care and thought given to the false witness. So the judges are to make a thorough inquiry and to search into the matter rather than just killing them effectively. What's more, it's not so that the false witness suffers the death penalty, but instead that anything that he meant to do to his brother is to be done to him. So the idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth here, like talionis, that could mean that if he was trying to rob him of his land, he would then give his land. If he was trying to rob him of cattle, for example, he would give him cattle. So it's this idea of you don't necessarily have to pay with your life, because obviously the human life is very valuable to God, but rather you must repay, at least pay something for your sin. And I think that's where there's a more theological focus here. Whereas the Code of Hammurabi, it's just if someone's a false witness, you just kill them. Far more harsh and more political than the Torah. And finally, this is a complete inversion. So if a slave says to his master in the Code of Hammurabi, "You are not my master," if they convict him, his master shall cut his ear off. Very clear. If a slave denies his master, cut his ear off. Whereas in the Torah, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he will serve only 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. The idea here is that in the ancient Near East, slavery was indeed a permanent thing for people, whereas in Israel, again, human life is valuable to God, and man is the image of God, and so you can't denigrate a human being below an animal, for example. You might have an ox serve you its entire life and die in your service, but you cannot treat a human like that. And so the idea that you will only keep him for 6 years and on the 7th he shall go free is the idea that it comes from the theology of creation, it comes from the theology of the Sabbath, it comes from the theology of the Jubilee, that on the 7th, and the number 7, there is restitution made and freedom given. And that's just not the case in the Code of Hammurabi. It's assumed that slavery is permanent there. But more so, it says that if a slave plainly says that I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him to God, bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. So what we have here is, instead of the context of a man saying, "You're not my master," denying his master, and the punishment of that being that his ears cut off, here it's the opposite. A slave is meant to go free, but if the slave does not want to go free, then there's almost a ritual or symbolic punishment in an ear piercing. So the ear is still the recipient of the act, but instead of it being an actual punishment of cutting the ear off, it's a symbolic punishment of boring the ear through or piercing the ear. And that's meant to sort of show, I suppose, the community that the slave is meant to go free, and in accordance with the law he should be free, but as a symbolic punishment, because he chose not to go free, he will now be given this earring to symbolize that. So completely different from the Code of Hammurabi there. So from these parallels, we see that the Torah is actually really not just another ancient Near Eastern law code, because the expectations that Yahweh places on his people are extremely countercultural and far more theologically charged than the political judgment of the Code of Hammurabi. An added element in the distinction is that the clear secularity presented in the Hammurabi Code is compared to the heavy theological and religious overtones that are at the heart of the Torah. And that's something that I mentioned a little bit over and over again. And this is because, as Mullah states, Hammurabi's laws are responses to practical needs, whereas the Torah is a response to spiritual or theological needs and speculations with the biblical legislations. So that's why the Hammurabi Code provides a much earlier example of ancient Near Eastern ethics, for example, or law. It certainly does pale in comparison to the radical grace and morality presented to us within the Torah of Moses. So the Torah is a later development, but it's definitely a more anthropocentric, more theocentric law. It's more theologically charged. It has the Israelite perspective on creation and God and man as the image of God in view, rather than just a human, secular, political view. Walton, I think, really sums up these differences in this table. So he says that the Torah, for example, is an essential self-revelation of God, whereas the ancient Near Eastern laws are self-glorification of the king. And so there's the theological and the judicial or political differences there. Likewise, the covenant charter of the Torah synthesizes an entire detailed and organized vision of the right exercise of what it means to be a holy nation, whereas the ancient Near Eastern laws represent a political charter that synthesize an entire detailed organized vision of the right exercise of justice. The Torah is a stipulation of the covenant, whereas the Hammurabi or ancient Near Eastern codes are treatises on jurisprudence. The Torah is a portrayal of the ideal covenant keeper as the central key theme, whereas the ancient Near Eastern codes portray the ideal state of the king. The prime purpose of the biblical compilation is maintaining order in sacred space, living in proximity to holiness of God, and therefore very theological and theocentric. Whereas the ancient Near Eastern laws, the prime purpose is the maintaining of order through political justice, much more anthropocentric, and focused on the glory of the king and the glory of the people. And the reason for this is because of the theological assumptions of both. So Walton says that the Israelites viewed Yahweh not just as the steward and administrator of the control attributes of the cosmos, but as the originator and shaper of all the attributes as well. So the Torah then, Yahweh makes decrees and issues commands and imposes stipulations on his people because of this theological understanding that he is the originator and creator and steward and the one that holds in balance the created order. That's the theological charge behind the Torah. Whereas in the ancient Near Eastern understanding, though the kings often engaged in these activities, the gods never involved themselves in anything so programmatic. So there's no theological weight behind them. Nothing in the ancient Near East compares to the extent of revelation that Yahweh gives to his people and the depth of relationship that he desires with them. That's the other key thing. The purpose of the Torah is so that God's people may live in relationship with God. And that's definitely not on view in other ancient Near Eastern laws. The centrality of this revelation in Israel's epistemology results in the idea that every aspect of life, custom, ethics, and order, cosmic and social, derives from Yahweh no matter how it is received. And that's the purpose of the Torah, and that's the theological assumption of the Torah, which, as we've seen, is very different from the ancient Near Eastern understanding. The final section we'll look at is the wisdom literature and proverbs of the ancient Near East. This obviously makes up a lot of the literature in the Old Testament, so I think it would be helpful to compare the two. And just as we saw that the cultic and legal and social and religious understandings of the ancient Near East are very parallel with the Bible, when we turn to the wisdom traditions of the ancient Near East, we find the same sort of similarities with the wisdom literature in the Bible. What we can determine from this is another example of what we've been calling the common cognitive environment, and where all these traditions of both the ancient world and the Bible existed and interacted together. Ideas of blessing and curse, retribution and success are all connected with this common cognitive environment, which we can observe in the many forms of wisdom instruction preserved from the period. So the first thing we look at is what I would like to call Babylonian Job. And we see this understanding of appeasing the gods and retribution and suffering compared to the biblical understanding of these. So in the Ladlul Bel Nemechi, which is a ancient, I believe, Mesopotamian text, the writer says, "I wish I knew that these things were pleasing to one's God. What is proper to oneself is an offense to one's God. What is in one's heart seems despicable. What in one's heart seems despicable is proper to one's God. Who can learn the reasoning of the gods in heaven? Who could understand the intentions of the God of the depths? Where might man have learned the way of God?" And basically, the point there is that God is unknowable and that humanity cannot discern what God's expect of them. There's a similar understanding in Job, where one of Job's friends says, "Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable. The Almighty, we cannot find him. For he is great in power, and justice and abundant righteous he will not violate. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit." So the idea that men cannot understand God, and so therefore Job should just accept that he doesn't understand what's going on and just try and appease God and get on with it, is the logic there. That's reflected in the ancient Near Eastern understanding. Likewise, in the aptly named prayer to every god, named because if you don't know what you did wrong, you better just pray to all of the gods, and hopefully one of them that you offended might be pleased with you again. Which I think, just as a side note, shows that Yahweh took great pains in expressing to his people exactly what he expected of them, exactly what he desired and what they needed to do to live in relationship with him. The ancient Near Eastern gods do not do this. They do not extend the same grace, and therefore you have a lot of this literature which just says, "I don't know what I did, but I hope I can fix it." Whereas with Israel and with Yahweh, it's definitely that they know what is done wrong and they're able to make restitution for that. Of course, in the context of Job, we understand Job to be pre-Moses, so pre-Torah. And so this is an example in the Bible of people who, before the law is revealed, are struggling with this concept. Read in the prayer to every god that the wrong which I did I do not know. The sin which I committed I do not know. The taboo which I broke I do not know. The bounds I crossed I do not know. And this is similar in Job 7, where Job says, "If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of humankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity?" This idea of, I don't know what I've done to you to deserve this, sort of a thing. Prayer to every god continues, "I would constantly seek for help, but no one would help me. I cried, but they did not approach me. I would give a lament, but no one heard me. I am distressed and alone and cannot see." And in Job, obviously, this idea where Job's friends will say, "Well, call, is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn?" Meaning the angels. They're no help to you. No one will come to your aid because you're in the wrong, effectively. And we could also link that with the psalmist, which says, "I give a lament, I am abandoned, I have no hope, I cannot see," as well. Obviously, in the Psalms, there's the hope that Yahweh will redeem, and the psalmist always relates that fact. But I think in Job here, it's much more akin to the ancient Near Eastern perspective. It goes on that humanity is deaf and does not know anything. Humanity, what do they know? Whether a person does wrong or good, they're ignorant. And in Job, this passage is not really quite the same, but it's this idea of lying in the earth, and if you seek me, I will not be. It's this idea that man is nothing in compared to God. They're ignorant in compared to God. And the idea that humanity is deaf and is ignorant of God's ways, of course, was also expressed in those verse 20 to 21. As well as Job 7. So I think to understand this, John Walton has a great summary where he says that ethical crimes of violation of social or cultic norms would be possible but difficult to identify specifically. The minds of the gods were not easily penetrated, and since they typically believed that their suffering was the result of God's anger, they naturally sought to appease that anger. And the procedure that Job's friends were suggesting urges Job to do this, to appease God through a procedure of confession. So in this aspect, Job's friends are representing the revered ancient Near Eastern wisdom tradition that we've just seen in those scriptures, those traditions and those manuscripts. But also, and I think this is really interesting of how the book of Job is working, unbeknownst to Job's friends, they are also making the case that the adversary or Satan was pressing. If they had persuaded Job to follow their advice and make a general confession just to appease God and be restored to favor, then the adversary's contention would have been confirmed. Righteousness is not the issue, only reward. But instead, the integrity that Job maintained and indeed continued to express that he was in the right was one that insisted that his righteous standing with God was far more important than just getting favor or being blessed by God, which is against what the adversary is saying. If this interpretation is accurate, the book of Job argues pointedly against the theodicy philosophies, the God judgment philosophies of the ancient Near East, and actually represents the clear Israelite interpretation of God's wisdom and justice. So this is the whole purpose of the book. The purpose of the book of Job is to counteract the typical ancient Near Eastern view of justice and the gods, and say, no, God doesn't work this way. God works in a different way, and that's sort of the logic of the book. Walton concludes that if it's determined that God is wise, which indeed is what God does, when God appears to Job, all he does is defend his wisdom in creating the world. He doesn't give an account to Job. He doesn't explain the whole background to what was happening. He doesn't need to because he's God. He simply just defends his wisdom and his creative authority. And that is enough for Job to recognize the mystery of the whole thing. So, returning to Walton's conclusion, if it's determined that God is wise, then it accepted that he's just, even if not all the information to evaluate his justice is available. And that definitely relates to us. We know that God is wise, and therefore we know that because of that, he is ultimately just. But often we don't have all the answers as to why we suffer, and that's simply a fact of life. And that's what the wisdom of Job is trying to communicate, very much against the ancient Near Eastern perspective of that. And then we'll just finish up with the Proverbs. So, as well as parallels with the literature of Job, we also find many Near Eastern precursors to literature that we find in the Proverbs. Themes like a father's teaching to his son, or the prospering of the righteous, or the statutes of wisdom, or the warning against the strange woman are found in all of these texts. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. He who knows to respect religious affairs, who voluntarily pleases his God, who performs the rites, to whom the name of his God is dear, who keeps away from swearing, who goes straight to the place of worship, that what he has lost is restored to him. This is from the instructions of Ernenöter. We see that in Proverbs 3 there's this similar idea. Let not the steadfast love and faithfulness of God forsake you, bind them around your neck, so that you will find favor and success in the sight of God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, he will make straight your paths. So you can see parallels there with, making straight your paths and the straight paths of the worshipper in the Ernenöter inscription. The understanding of religious affairs and pleasing God is connected with the steadfast love and faithfulness that is communicated through God's law and wisdom. And just as the Ernenöter inscription says, the one who sticks to this will be blessed. It's the same in Proverbs 3. This blessing will be shown in the ways that days will be added and years will be plenty. See in Proverbs 10 that the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be short. We also see that in Deuteronomy that God says that if you obey my laws, it will go well with you and you will live a long life in the land that I am giving you. And also in the Ernenöter description, his descendants will experience good health. His heir will pour water libations, and his God will look favorably upon him. In Proverbs 14, we read that the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence, and his children will make refuge from it. So it's this idea of connecting with the descendants. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, just as the heir of the righteous man will pour forth water, is the image in the Ernenöter description. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, and the one that one may turn away from the snares of evil. And that's definitely the logic of the Proverbs, and as we can see, also of the Ernenöter inscription. I love this connection. This is in a Egyptian script, simply just called the teaching of a man to his son. But it starts off with a very similar phrase, the beginning of the teaching which a father made for his son. He says, hearken to my voice, do not neglect my words, and do not despise what I want to say to you. This is very similar to the words in Proverbs 1. Hear, my son, your father's instructions, and do not forsake my teaching or your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and a pendant for your neck. So very similar there. We read on, earn respect for yourself. Do not go too far in this. Laziness is not seemly for a wise man. Be reliable and silent. Bend your arm and be benevolent. And in the Proverbs, we have this idea of do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great. It is better to be told, come up here, than to be put in a lower place in the presence of a noble. And this is the logic behind Jesus' parable where he says, do not put yourself in the seat of honor first, for it is better to be called up than to be humbled, is the logic there. And it's this idea in the teaching of a man to his son that be humble, be benevolent, and bend your arm, which is the understanding of a gesture of prostration before someone who is superior to you. It goes on, he who makes the ignorant a wise man and the one who hates becomes beloved. He makes the humble surpass the great, and the last is the first. That's very similar to Jesus' words in Matthew 19, the last shall be first. In Proverbs, we have a similar understanding. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before us fall, but it is better to be of lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. And this idea of humility, having a low spirit, being humble, and this is obviously the logic behind the last will be first. And even beforehand, the idea of not putting yourself in a high position, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put in a lower position. So humility again. It finishes, he teaches the dumb to speak and opens the ears of the deaf. And we read in the Proverbs that this inversion of this, do not speak in the hearing of a fool. And the Hebrew word for fool there is the word of like someone who's dumb or deaf and they cannot speak and hear. For he will despise the good sense of your wisdom or your teaching. That's the idea of teaching the dumb to speak and opening the ears. And obviously that relates to Jesus as well, who came to open the ears and teach the ignorant of the ways of the law. And you can see that in Proverbs as well. And finally, the connection with the understanding of the foreign woman, which I found really interesting. So in the teaching of Ani, which is another Egyptian manuscript, it says, be on your guard against a woman from abroad, whom no one knows in her city. Read in Proverbs 7, behold, the woman meets him, and this is the forbidden woman, or the strange woman, or the woman from abroad in Proverbs 5. Dressed as a prostitute, she is loud and wayward, her feet do not stay at home. We read on, do not gaze at her as she goes past, and do not know her, which implies sexual relations. In Proverbs 6, do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. The idea of do not gaze at her, do not be seduced by her. She is deep water, the extent of which no one knows. And then in Proverbs 5, we read that her feet go down to death, and her feet, or her steps, follow the path to Sheol. And obviously understanding the three-tiered cosmos, that Sheol is beneath the waters, makes sense of the idea of she is deep water. She goes down into this place. That is where she makes her abode. We read on, a woman whose husband is far away says daily to you, I am beautiful, when she has no witnesses. This is very similar to Proverbs 7, 18 to 19. She says, come, let us take our full of love till morning, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. This idea of the absence of the husband and the adultery of the foreign woman or the strange woman. Finally, it says, she waits and sets her trap, a great crime and great death when it is known. And this is very similar to the conclusions of Proverbs 7. It says that she waits and lies in wait, like a predator, very much like setting a trap in the teaching of Ani. And it goes on, with her smooth talk she compels him. He does not know that it will cost him his life. So the idea of death being associated with this woman. So I think those parallels are fascinating. The reason for these parallels, Walton will say, is because the Israelite sages of old, from Solomon through to the post-exilic period, had certainly imbibed of the wisdom traditions of their ancient neighbors in the ancient world, and were therefore heirs to some of the literary traditions. They had clearly embraced wholeheartedly the literary traditions of the ancient world, and had readily accepted the responsibility to inculcate and propagate wisdom and its corollary wise living. But there is a clear difference in this. This difference is based on the Israelite ontology, where they saw wisdom as derived from God and wise living as intrinsically necessitating a relationship with God, rather than just good wisdom or good teaching, which is very much sort of the aspect, again, of the social focus of the ancient Near Eastern literature, specifically defined by the covenant. Again, we come back to the covenant relationship with Yahweh as the foundation point for the Old Testament laws and wisdom literature and all of the literature, to be honest. And I think this final comment can sum up the entire discussion of this whole session we've been looking at, is that one cannot speak of debt, but must be content to speak of commonalities that reveal that Israel shared a stake in the cognitive environment of the ancient world. And that refers, I think, to everything we've been looking at. Just because there's similarities in the wisdom literature, just because there's similarities in the prophetic literature, in the creation literature, in the practices of the cult, of practices of religion, of temples, etc., etc. That doesn't mean that the Bible is indebted to these ancient Near Eastern cultures, but it rather communicates that they all share, and in fact, Israel has a stake in the cognitive environment of the ancient world. And recall back at the start that Helmer Ringren pointed out that this comparative study is meant to show not that they are indebted to the context, but that rather Israel is quite unique in compared to the context. And we see that especially as well with the wisdom literature, as Walton points out, that it's this distinct ontology of being derived from God and relating to God in a covenant understanding. So that will draw our session to a close. I know this one's been a bit longer, so I appreciate you for sticking it through. I think it'd just be helpful to summarize this way, that the Hebrew Bible exists within a larger context and indeed is a product of the ancient Near East, but it also differs greatly from much of the literature of that period. While there are many religious and cultural parallels which point to the fact that the Hebrew Bible was not created or compiled in a religious vacuum, much of its religious claims about God, the world, and ethics differ greatly from the cultural norms of the day. And so that's while the Bible is an ancient text written by and for an ancient people, it was and certainly still is a countercultural work of literature, which places before the reader its truths about God and the world, which causes any reader to consider the uniqueness of its literary makeup and design. And so that's what we're going to look at in the next session. We're going to look at the literary makeup of the Bible and how it's designed to be read in and of itself. So I hope you enjoyed that session, and hopefully we'll see you back for the next one. Thanks.